Um, hello, hi. Thank you for being here today. So, it's second day of Let There Be Lumbung is starting now. And as I mentioned before, the event is streamed, so I hope everybody's okay in the room of being streamed. And also welcome to everybody that's watching online. And just want to say that today we're going to have John Rosa first presenting, followed by Q&A. Then we're going to have a break, and then we are back for Charles Esche, also followed by a Q&A, and then we are done for today, and I hope to see you tomorrow. Without further ado, I want to invite Mirwan Andan to the stage from Ruang Grupa, and welcome.
Check. Sorry. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and good afternoon. First of all, thank you so much for all of you, who are sitting or standing in this arena, ruruHaus. Today we are in the second day of the talks of Let There Be Lumbung. Yesterday we had a very fruitful conversation with our dear Philip Pirote, and today we are going to continue with two guest speakers from two different time zones. And what There Be Lumbung is about, it's a panel about the origins of Lumbung, its a social and historical context, repercussions, and its potentialities beyond D15. We are inviting scholars, academic people who have been working in a very scientific approach, but also at the same times, they are cultural practitioners who have been very serious in their field. And they are coming from several time zones. And today we are going to have John Roosa, a professor who has been teaching at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver, Canada. He just arrived yesterday, and then soon after he arrived, he joined the first session. And then after that, we were hanging out at one of our friends' house because he invited us, one of our friends in this, from Ruang Rupa, who has been living in Kassel, invited us to come for dinner at his house. So also John joined us, and then after that, we ended up hanging out. So John is actually both as a scholar and also cultural practitioners. He is an Indonesianist who is not only see Indonesian people as an informant or do not see Indonesian as informants in his research, but he has been working for several years. Since 1994, he started to visit Indonesia, and then how he has been working on Indonesia not only as a field work but also as a part of his way of seeing the world. His work, including a pretext of mass murder, it was translated to Bahasa Indonesia a couple of years ago, but then he just published his new work titled Buried Histories, the Anti-Communist Massacre of 1965 and to 1966 in Indonesia. So I'm not going to be very long to introduce John Roosa, and then here we invite John Roosa to join us in this session.
Yeah, thank you, Andan. Thank you, everyone in Ruang Rupa for inviting me here, and to the various technicians here and staff. who've put this event together. As Andan said, I'm a historian of Indonesia. That's been my specialization. And so I thought today that I would provide some context to ruang rupa, to explain a little bit about where ruang rupa is coming from, something about the cultural politics of Indonesia. So the lumbung is this symbol or metaphor for common property, commoning, holding things in common, that ruang rupa has been using for this documenta and calling this lumbung number one. And it would be really interesting if I gave a talk about the history of common property in Indonesia, because there's a long history of that, and many groups in Indonesia have been experts at maintaining common property resources. But actually, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to be speaking more about the anti-common property resources group. I'm going to be speaking about how Indonesia came to be dominated by militarized conglomerates that are committed to private property and profit-making. So I see ruang rupa as a group that's trying to overcome this history, trying to awaken from this nightmare that is history, while holding on to certain elements from the past, like these common property practices, which still exist to some in attenuated form. So, and I also want to speak about the relationship between ruang rupa and this first generation of cultural activists in Indonesia. The cultural activists of this period from 1945, when Indonesia proclaimed its independence, to 1965, when the military took power and committed many massacres and victimized many of those cultural activists of that generation, that sort of first generation of Indonesian artists, and people who were very active in the Bandung Conference, the Asia-Africa Conference of 1955 in Bandung, people who sang songs about Asia-Africa and wrote quite a lot about it and organized along those lines as well. And then ultimately my aim is just to prompt a general discussion about the meaning of decolonization and anti-colonization today, and also how we should relate to these earlier generations of anti-colonial activists, how we should think about that. So it's in the question and answer, I just hope to have a general discussion about those themes, and I think it could be a continuation from the discussions yesterday after Philippe's talk. So my research in history has been focused on these series of events that happened in 1965-66 that resulted not just in the creation of an army dictatorship, but also the death and disappearance of hundreds of thousands of people who had been part of the left-wing movement in Indonesia. And that was a movement that had really grown out of the struggle for independence. From 1945 to 49, there was an armed struggle, there was a nationalist struggle, wide-ranging struggle against the Dutch attempt at recolonization, which ultimately ended with the departure of the Dutch in 1949. I said my research, which isn't entirely accurate. I've been working with a group of Indonesian activists and academics who have been committed to the democratic ideals of Indonesia. And we've set up an organization called the Indonesian Institute of Social History, which has a website if you're interested in it. And my colleagues and I at the Institute conducted oral interviews with hundreds of ex-political prisoners of that 1965 generation and their relatives and other survivors of that violence. So this was a violence that targeted the supporters of the Indonesian Communist Party, the PKI, and it was a very thorough and systematic repression of the PKI, the Communist Party, and all of the organizations that were affiliated to it. Anti-communist violence is nothing special in the world in the 20th century. It happened everywhere, including Germany, of course, and the one, I guess, special thing about the anti-communist violence in Indonesia was just how thorough it was. There were over 1 million people who were imprisoned as political prisoners. And there were, we don't know how many people died, but it's hundreds of thousands of people were massacred. And my book, Buried Histories, is about those mass killings. And one of the arguments is that it should be called mass disappearances. And I use this painting as the cover for the book because it sort of illustrates the argument that we use the phrase mass killings, but really this was a matter of taking prisoners out of detention camps and prisons and military bases and putting them into trucks and taking them out, usually at night, and massacring them and then burying the bodies in mass graves or throwing the corpses into rivers. So these were disappearances. The families were never told what had happened to their loved ones. And there's a special kind of atrociousness with disappearances, right? Because it destroys the knowledge, destroys community relations, because people don't know whether the person just moved away and is in hiding, or has escaped somewhere and is still alive and will come back, or whether they actually have died. There's no funeral. In Indonesia, funerary rites are really important, and there was no chance to hold those rites. And often families were uncertain as to whether they should hold the rites or not. This painting is by Joko Peke, who was a political prisoner and who saw people being taken out of the prison in Yogyakarta and never being heard from again. And this is a kind of killing that's really difficult to document. And so the book is using oral histories, oral interviews, as well as many other kinds of sources, also from perpetrators and witnesses, to try to figure out exactly how these were organized. Although there's many questions that I still can't answer about it, as to why, in some cases, exactly who was responsible. So there's no photographs, and so I'm using these paintings as ways of just giving a visual sense that it was real and it occurred, that these were massacres that happened. This is a painting from another ex-political prisoner, Miss Baktamadan. Both of Joko Peke and Miss Baktamadan are still alive. And he was depicting a father being called out, the name being called out, and then being loaded onto a truck and then executed. So I've been very interested in disappearances, and one thing I'm working on now is sort of how artists respond to disappearances. And you'll notice that one of the ways that they do that has been because of the disappearances in Argentina and Chile and other parts of Latin America, events as well as of the individuals. And I should mention that this action of the Indonesian military, the total elimination of the Communist Party, became a model for anti-communist militaries elsewhere in the world. And the United States was very proud of what had happened and promoted it to around the world. And the military in Chile and in Argentina became very famous for putting into practice what the author Vincent Bevins has called the Jakarta Method, which it was a kind of paradigm to strive to, that yes, just mass arrests and then disappearances of those prisoners, and that you can actually destroy a whole movement. So it's important to remember that this, what happened in Indonesia in 65, 66 became an ideal that anti-communists around the world strove towards. I'll mention briefly that I think it can be called a genocide. I don't want to get involved in this debate. There's a kind of what I'd call a definitional deadlock around the term genocide, but it is a genocide in the way academics study genocide and in the way that the originator of the term, Raphael Lemkin, meant it. So, and I think genocide studies is relevant to this case because one of the themes in genocide studies is about the element of paranoia, that perpetrators are always claiming self-defense, so they have to pretend as if the victims, who were unarmed, defenseless civilians in the Indonesian case, most of them were prisoners, tied up already. They have to present them as mortal threats. They have to position the victims as the perpetrators. And so in Indonesia, the myth is of, I forgot about this one. This was the one case in Indonesia where they used the headshots to represent the disappeared, and this was in 1998, when the military disappeared some activists. So this is an example of the propaganda that was used at the time. And in this case, the headline is, a woman who is 3 months pregnant was trained to kill people. And there's a picture of the woman at the bottom there. And this was part of the psychological warfare being waged in the media. This is from a military newspaper. The military, after October 1st, censored all the newspapers that they allowed to publish. And they just relentlessly, day after day, presented stories about how the PKI, the Communist Party, was immoral, satanic, evil. And they chose the most innocuous of images, in this case, a pregnant woman, in other cases, a youth, and presented them as though they were just the epitome of evil. So the mass media, as you know, has been, very skillful at monstering. That was the term that the Murdoch's newspapers used for what they did, to take daycare center workers and turn them into, monsters, to turn them into, non-human people. So, and it's very difficult to build communities when we're dealing with the mass media and with this kind of these practices of monstering. They influence how we see each other, and they also influence even how we perceive ourselves. So this is the kind of propaganda that existed at the time, and it's continued in various forms in Indonesia ever since, but the media landscape has changed quite a lot. Western countries played a major role in bringing this Suharto, the General Suharto, to power, making sure that he could take power. Germany provided a lot of aid to the army, specifically, so that it could take power. A German journalist wrote the first biography of Suharto in 1969. He was a former SS officer who worked for the BND in the 1950s, and he was stationed in Indonesia. So this violence was largely organized by the Army's territorial command. And this is a kind of unique feature of Indonesia, which I think a lot of foreigners don't grasp, is that when we're speaking about the Army, we're not just speaking about the Army in barracks. In the late 50s, early 60s, they developed this system, and then after 65, institutionalized it even further. So there's a portion of the Army, I'm not quite sure how many, it's a quarter to a third of the personnel in the Army are stationed inside Indonesia to monitor Indonesians. And they have a nested hierarchy. This map just shows what are called the kodams. But underneath every kodam, there's other layers that go all the way to the village. And so if you go to any village in Indonesia today, there will be a private or corporal stationed there. In some more remote areas, it might be one of those guys for several villages, but they have a way of monitoring the whole society. It's not like a totalitarian system, but it's just, the army is inside the country, devoting a lot of its energy to policing as a kind of supra-police force. This is in addition to the police, sort of monitoring the situation, as the term goes. They're just sort of surveying what's going on. And so they play a major role, and sort of oversized role, within Indonesian society. And they have been active in repressing any kind of activism. And any kind of activism becomes labeled as communist. Meanwhile, they help, the big corporations cut down the forest to create palm oil plantations, or to help in the burning of the forest. And they play a major role in preventing the resistance to these various assaults on common property resources. And one thing that the Army does is it routinely creates hysterias or moral panics around the revival of communism. Because ultimately, territorial command is superfluous now. It's sort of devoted to anti-communism. And so in order to justify their continued existence, they have to keep claiming that there is a threat of a communist revival. And to give you an example of this, in 1993, there was a moral panic created for a number of cases, and this was one case where there was a cassette that had a little hammer and sickle on it in the design. And the Army of the Territorial Command freaked out. And so the Army, working with the police, went around and confiscated all these cassette tapes, I should say. And they investigated who was responsible for this. They interrogated everybody who was involved in the making of this album. And it was extensively covered in the media as well. And there were other cases in 1993 of a small town in East Java. A key ring was discovered that had a hammer on one side and an axe on the other. And the local army commander said, well, that's close enough to being a hammer and sickle. And so he says, it indicates, this is a quote, it indicates that the Communist Party still exists. Those ignorant of politics will not understand it, but for us, it is clear that this decoration means something, that this symbol means something. And so every time they see a hammer and sickle, the army immediately starts claiming that it's purposefully created by somebody in the PKI. So there were many other cases in 1993, and the Indonesian scholar Ariel Haryanto has written a great article about this, an article called Where Communism Never Dies, that came out in 1999. And it's true. I mean, the army is continually creating this idea of the PKI is still existing. The collapse of the Suharto dictatorship in 1998 didn't end these moral panics, and it didn't end the territorial command either. So still today, the territorial command exists. There are a number of officers who say, actually this really isn't necessary, and we could at least begin to reduce it. But for various reasons, it has remained the same. And so the moral panics continue. The last peak was in 2016-17. I put this example on the left because it has something to do with Germany. The German band, metal punk band Creator, held a concert in East Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And on their album cover, they put an image of a hammer and sickle. And so somebody in Indonesia just reproduced that image on T-shirts, and the police and army went wild and started interrogating everybody who was involved in it, and held press conferences on how this represents a revival of the Communist Party. And so there were more and more T-shirts that they found that had the hammer and sickle on it, and in each case, so you have active duty army officers involved in policing the T-shirts being worn by youths. And they keep interpreting every appearance of this symbol as an example of the resurgence of the PKI. And in 2016-17, this was just kept going on and on. They even got to the point where they were looking at the wallpaper of KFC in Kalimantan, which just so happened to have it on a representation of a spine of a book. And this is covered in the media. And there was one Indonesian artist who decided to satirize this. So this was an example of being satirical. He created fake news about how the police confiscated fish that had the hammer and sickle image on it. And when I first read this, I thought it was true. I really, yeah, that makes sense. It turned out to be just a satire. He was being sarcastic. The most recent example, which is, really indicates how strange things are, is that a retired commander of the entire military, this is Gatot Nurmantio, claimed, just last year that these 3 statues went missing in an army museum, and that must have represented the work of the communists who had infiltrated to the highest levels of the military. And it turned out a former army officer who had become a devout Muslim, who was a commander of that particular regiment, had decided to remove the statues because he thought that it was anti-Islamic to represent humans in this way. But Nurmantio said, no, this must have been the work of the PKI. So all of these sort of moral panics around the resurgence of the PKI, so forth, it's meant to keep this territorial command going. It's meant to keep the army as a sort of, legitimate actor for internal security. And what that means is, the continued repression of activists in Indonesia. Another case in 2016-17 was, there was just a symposium to talk about what happened in '65 that had official government backing from one group within the government. And another group within the government decided to hold a rival symposium and to say that this was an example of the resurgence of the PKI, and so they're having they had a rival symposium, it says in their slogan, against the threat of the resurgence of the PKI and other ideologies. They were kind of general about that. And they were worried about that some mass graves would be exhumed and there would be more people learning about what happened in '65, '66. And so the panic is also about preventing people from understanding this history. of the PKI and where it came from. And one of the concerns is, getting people to understand why so many artists supported the PKI. During that repression, in 65, 66, many artists became victims because some of the best artists of Indonesia had been affiliated to the PKI. The writer, Pramoedya, which you've probably heard of, the dramatist, Utwi Sontani, another great artist, Trubus, disappeared, Joko Peke, Miss Baktamanen, I've already mentioned. They all became political prisoners or were killed or disappeared. And so I want to talk a bit about that, generation, that first generation, who were really inspired by what they called the August 1945 revolution, when Indonesia proclaimed its independence. I'm sorry if the font is a little bit small for those in the back. I'm used to a classroom, and I should have thought about this larger room. So I'm using this French philosopher Alain Badiou's idea of the truth event as, this is an event that you have to sort of design your life so that you are faithful to the meaning of that event and work through the meaning of that event. And the August 45 revolution was that event for that first generation of nationalist artists. They were very much against the sort of portrait painting in the style of the Dutch. This was a famous photograph by Cartier-Bresson about the Dutch as they were leaving in late '49, taking away the portraits of the governor-generals from the palace. And I just mentioned briefly, too, that there's this great installation done by an Indonesian artist at an exhibition that was held this year in Amsterdam, playing off of that photograph by taking the empty frames and sort of representing, this sort of the end of this formal colonialism. And they were also against, that first generation of Indonesian artists were also against this kind of style of painting, which Dutch artists and other European artists had popularized and had taught in art institutes as well, this beautiful Indies style. And I wanted to say a little bit in closing in my final minutes about this example of Hendra Gunawan, who I think was sort of at the time in that period from 45 to 1965, before he himself was put into prison, was recognized as one of Indonesia's greatest painters. You notice the landscape is there, but this time within that landscape, that beautiful landscape, there's fighting, and he's foregrounding the figures of those who participated in the nationalist struggle and in the armed struggle. And Hendra was particularly concerned about representing the guerrilla fighters, as well as the what's called the common people or ordinary people. In this case, a farmer and his family returning from fishing at what would have been a common property resource, a stream or a river or a pond. And he was part of a group, it was called a Sangard, a kind of art studio where a lot of different artists, so even though Hendra was, sort of well-known, great artist, he worked within a collective. And a lot of different reasons for why these collectives formed and so forth, but a lot of artists at that time existed within collectives in these Sangars. And this was Hendra's, the Sangar, the collective that Hendra was part of. Also part of it was another famous Indonesian painter, Affandi, who's also pictured there. And it did not mean that working in the Sangha sort of represented in sort of denial of the self or the individualization. And these are just some great self-portraits. Another Sangha was formed, I'm going through this quickly, by Amrus I'll just call him Amrus, and his friends as a kind of rival to, not a rival, but a kind of to move beyond the Hendra's collective. And this was, Amrus was also sort of affiliated himself with the PKI. When you look at this painting, do you recognize the style? Do you see it as any, does it remind you of anybody that you're familiar with? Huh? So Amrus was influenced by Diego Rivera at this particular time. And so, one reason that a lot of artists were affiliating themselves to the PKI was because it was a cosmopolitan organization and put them in touch with trends going on in the rest of the world, but it also put them in touch with peasants and farmers and workers. It grounded them. And in this case, Amrus was trying to represent a struggle in which peasants trying to reclaim their land were murdered. And this was called the Genco Incident because it happened in this village of Genco. And so Amrus was saying, let's not just represent common people, let's represent people in struggle. And the emphasis was on the struggles, not just on, pictures of paintings of a common person. I should mention that there was another group of artists who were quite happy that Suharto took power and suppressed the Communist Party. And this is one artist who painted this as a way of saying, it was great. This was a new dawn after hendra And he was in the same city as Hendra Gunawan, where Hendra was being imprisoned. I'll skip that. Hendra was imprisoned for 12 years. And these were just two paintings. Notice he was in better condition than a lot of other prisoners because he was painting and he was able to sell some of the artwork. And it was actually a collective in the prison. I interviewed some of another member of that collective who helped him out in the painting while in prison. He was representing boils on his skin on the right-hand picture there. So he's this incredible artist is imprisoned, and but once he's released, he's really desperate for money because he's being, all the political prisoners were being stigmatized, and he starts painting things for his new patrons, and some other paintings that were really just for the market. And I'll end with this idea of, Hendra Gunawan's paintings became really beloved by one of the tycoons who had become very wealthy during the Suharto period. And he collected all of Hendra's paintings. So even though he was a communist, Hendra had been part of the PKI, this tycoon just loved his paintings. And this is, on the left, the breakfast bar at this five-star hotel in Surabaya has Hendra's paintings on the top of it. On the one hand, it's quite nice to see that there's this communist painter who had been victimized, is sort of, people are getting to know his paintings, and it's circulating. And Ciputra, this tycoon, also created a museum in downtown Jakarta just for Hendra's paintings. And he produced the book too, out of which I took the slides of his paintings. That was a Ciputra financed big glossy book, and so it's great that. But this is what Hendra had to do, in a way to survive after the destruction of his collective and his group of artists in 1965. And I see Ruang Rupa as, kind of wanting to avoid this kind of art of producing objects that can be bought and sold and then hung on some wall of a very rich person's house. So, and they have been emphasizing social relationships, and I think that is a really good way to go. And the earlier generations, I see it, were supportive of that. They didn't really articulate it in the same way, given that they were also influenced by the Communist Party's theorizations of art. But they were, I think, interested in some of the same ideas about collectives, about building community, about cultivating relationships of sharing and cooperation. And I think those are very important themes when looking at the kind of cultural destruction that has gone on in Indonesia since 1965. I've gone over time, I'm sorry. I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you, John Roosa, for your presentations and also the talks. I also need to mention that John Roosa is also part of an organization he mentioned earlier that called Institute of Indonesian Social History that have been working since early 2000.
Yeah, about 20 years.
Yeah, about 20 years, the same age with, so kind of collective initiatives, communities or organizations, like ruruHaus also it was started in 2000, soon after the collapse of the New Order regime in 1998. So through this organization, John and some friends in Jakarta also have been organizing and conducting some research. One book that I need to mention is Tahun Yang Tak Pernah Berakhir, or The Endless Years, conducting based on the oral history research throughout the archipelago, especially in Java. In Java, I think.
Yeah, Java and Bali were the key cases. There was a bit about Sumatra as well in that book.
Yeah. So we are open now for questions and comments on what John just presented on the issue of moral panics. Earlier we also discussed that panic at the disco, or is it a panic in front of the image? Is it?
The panic around the image.
Yeah.
I mean, besides images, there are other sources of panics when an event or a piece of writing or something. But I was somewhat influenced by current events. Here to think about what was going on in Indonesia.
Yeah, do we have some comments or questions? Please, it's open now. We have two mics, links und rechts, right and left. Please, if you have any vragen, other questions or comments. Tafadhal, silakan. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I have a question about the artists you mentioned who are happy in the Suharto regime. They are, I think, Bandung artists. Do you have some explanation about that?
Yeah, I mean, well, from their own perspective, they felt like when they were exhibiting their artwork before 1965, that they were always being criticized. They didn't want to have to think about politics, whereas the artists that were affiliated with the PKI were emphasizing politics. But the politics they were emphasizing was actually this sort of 1945 revolution as the truth event. That is, their art was very populist in nature and very nationalist in nature. And that was one reason why many of these rich people after 1965 could still appreciate it, because it wasn't really full of Marxist-Leninist themes of class struggle and so forth. And it was often really beautiful, like in Amros's painting of what was a massacre of peasants. It was still a really striking work of art. And Amros, I should mention, has he's still alive and is still producing art, and it's amazing wood carvings that just about every rich person in Indonesia owns one of them. And he's become, by Indonesian standards, fairly wealthy. But yeah, these Bandung artists in particular were just felt free, that they didn't have to worry about other artists criticizing them for not really working through the meaning of the national revolution in the way that they were, and that they were sort of avoiding it. And that's why I sort of quickly, I was going to talk a little bit more about that image of the cats. That was one artist really, I love the paintings, but it has nothing to do with the national revolution, and they were really trying to avoid dealing with that, and so they felt free, after 65. And that's really what sort of the meaning of the Suharto regime was. It displaced the 45. That 45 was no longer the truth event for Indonesians, that they didn't have to think about it anymore. And instead, Suharto built up 65 as the truth event. That is, the meaning of what united Indonesians was that they were all against the communists. And we won't even have to think about the anti-colonial struggle. And the Suharto regime really didn't even know how to deal with that history of the anti-colonial struggle, because they were busy on their knees begging for foreign aid and foreign investment so that they could continue this massive rent-seeking operation that was the Suharto regime. So.
Okay, and following question. Because the institution of art in Bandung is established by the Dutch. Is that also a cause of this Bandung artists, how they, with their art?
Yeah, well, these particular artists that felt free to exhibit and were very happy after 65, they had, I don't know if all of them, but many of them certainly had been trained by the Dutch artists in Bandung. But I'm sure there were some people who were trained by the same Dutch artists who had different political leanings. So I wouldn't create a straightforward, they were accused of being sort of tied to the Dutch. But, there were many artists in Lekra who were fans of European art as well. So they shared a lot in common, actually. So.
You just mentioned an organization called Lekra, which is a people cultural organization, which is the art and cultural organization which was the underbow of Indonesian Communist Party. Yeah.
Yeah.
Tintin, you want to mention?
Yeah. Well, it's a privilege to be here and hear you talking in person, and also the conversations. And I actually feel, quite privileged as well my grandfather was taken away in 65, so I have that side of history. But also I have 8 half German cousins. So growing up, I was quite exposed to, like when you talked about moral panics earlier, and how images can trigger that. And so, I really appreciate your discussion on that, and I would like to ask you to clarify a bit more, maybe, because I feel there are differences and there are similarities, of course. And the images that cause moral panics here, the reference event that you mentioned earlier, and the image of the hammer and sickle, they're off quite different. Like they symbolize quite different positions in, I guess, power structures as well. And so, if you can you clarify that a little bit more? And I appreciate your discussion about the moral panics as well, and would you also please clarify the similarities between the use of these different images in the different contexts? Do you think
Yeah. Actually, I don't really want to get into a discussion. There's so many differences. I just wanted to bring out the similarity at a very general level, and let people try to, figure it out for themselves what the meaning is there, because there are many differences. I mean, what I would say is that the sort of every country has its own kind of idiosyncrasies in terms of, or triggers. I'm coming from a sort of U.S.-Canadian environment, what triggers and what causes offense, what causes a kind of a person to be offended, and every society has its own kinds of ways of, and those are historically changed as well. In the Indonesian case, it is, I think, it's clearly a kind of irrational response to the hammer and sickle. And there's actually, I didn't mention, there are quite a number of Indonesian officials who don't like it. And one reason the last panic was in 2016-17 is because the group around the current president has been trying to discourage that, and they don't like it, and they think it's a distraction, and they don't want to be bothered with this, and they know it's kind of silly. So they've been de-emphasizing that. But there's just this inertia, this historical legacy, which just keeps the army and some other state officials stuck in that kind of, if there's a sign of the PKI, if there's any kind of sign of leftism, we have to create a panic. And it's really useful for them. So there's questions here, number of questions here.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. You've right.
Yeah, I'm not going to thank you for your remarks. I'm not going to draw you too much onto dangerous ground since you brought up the subject of moral panic, but I might draw you a little closer and ask if you could maybe draw any conclusions or generalizations or have some insights on the idea of hypocrisy and othering in moral panic. Because I was really struck by this image you showed of the bar. So this breakfast bar in a 5-star hotel where presumably an extremely wealthy, ultra-capitalist hotel owner tycoon. For those of you who live in Germany, I don't think you understand how rich the rich are in the rest of the world when the 1% owns everything. It really is quite something to see this beautiful buffet with all the foods that the workers will never eat, and to have that tycoon sort of signal, perhaps, virtue by hanging this portrait of workers in struggle above. So I myself am not going to go into too dangerous ground by suggesting that there may be some virtue signaling going on in the present, in Germany, auf Deutschland. Aber, can you perhaps talk about this idea of othering guilt that might be internalized, and whether or not projecting this onto the other in a great signal is perhaps something that is human nature?
Yeah. In the... one thing I didn't mention was that panic in 2016-17 was partly a response to Joshua Oppenheimer's films, and which had come out in just in the previous years, and which were just about everybody in Indonesia watched because they were available for free online. Joshua made them available, and there was also an International People's Tribunal in The Hague in 2015. It was the 50th anniversary of the 65 events in 2015. So, and you notice in the act of killing in that film, the main character, Anwar Congo, is saying, I like watching this propaganda from the army because it reassures me. Because he's actually tormented by the killing. Yeah, he was, and there's other cases like this as well, of perpetrators, you know, in later years realizing that what they did was wrong, that they couldn't defend it. That at the time they have all this rhetoric. This is a war. This is a glorious, noble deed that we're doing by saving the country from the PKI. And in later years they had to realize, you know, no, we were just killing a bunch of tied up prisoners. There's nothing heroic about that at all. So in Ciputra's case, the tycoon owning Hendra's paintings, I don't know sort of whether it's there or not. I mean, it's amazing just, he just fell in love with these paintings. His commitment to it is just amazing. I mean, he had all these replicas done of images in the paintings to make them into statues, and he just poured so much money into it. And I think he was doing that while abstracting it from this communist connection and just saying, well, Hendra wasn't really communist and so forth. And so I don't think he was trying to be sort of signal virtue, but is trying to make his five-star hotels more cultured by saying this is high culture, you know. And it's just so happened that high culture in Indonesia in that period from 45 to 65 involved a lot of communist artists. So, yeah. Sorry,
I would like to refer to the moral panic. I'm born in the war, 42, I'm now 80 years old. And I can tell that we as young people had really moral panic because nobody told us what happened, but we felt that there was terribly things happening. And we had no books, we had no explanations, we had no teachers. The parents didn't touch the question what they have done in wartime. And the first who just opened our eyes was in the 60s when a judge came back and did the first concentration camp tribunal. I was about 20 years old, and I had always this gray in my back, and I thought, what happens behind me? I can't see it. So, and I just want to say, it took a long, long time in Germany. And when I think of Taring Party, after 30 years, we had 12 years in Germany, but very efficiently. After the 30 years, more than 30 years, and then they made a painting, People's Justice. After 4 years after Suharto was finished. So I will just mention the big difference and the courage they had and we didn't have. And I'm tired of our discussion here to blame the documenta because we had not been willing to look what they bring to us and what they want to dialogue with us. So this is why I did 20 accompany my friends to explain the documenta because it's not easy to come close to the contents. And I had been more than 50 times to the documenta because I was so outraged that I had to put a counterpart. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just mention something in response. I mean, you can perfectly understand how Indonesians felt after 1965, where they're being told that there was this terrible event and that they have to hate the PKI, but the government never went into any details. They just said the PKI was crushed, it was destroyed. But how, by whom, when, exactly? So they didn't talk about the massacres, and so there were rumors. Everybody had a rumor. Everybody sort of knew, actually, yes, there were these massacres. Yeah. So it was after, especially after Suharto's fall in 1998, where the artists were able to, sort of start trying to make it real, to try to tell people this really happened, and you have a lot of victims after 1998 too coming forward. And we were only able to do our research starting in 2000 because of the collapse of the Suharto regime. And so my work has been a collaborative project with Indonesian historians and activists to try to make sense of those events that have been so mysterious and yet talked about all the time, right? Everybody knows it, but yet nobody really understands what's going on here. It's like the September 30th movement. My book, Pretext for Mass Murder, was just about that little event, which was, all important, supposedly, for Indonesian history, but yet everybody, Indonesians had a strong sense that, we don't really understand what happened. The government keeps talking about this event, but it's not really allowing us to fully understand it. And so, yeah, this is what we've been trying to do. And many artists have been part of this project as well, to try to make sense of this history since '65. So.
Also to add what just John said, that we who were born and also grew up in the 80s, we need to watch a movie which is played once in a year on September 30 about a movie that was part of propaganda to monsterize us, and also to also some people I know who are really afraid of to see cycle after because of this movie.
Yeah.
So this presentation on dangerous image, including moving image.
Yes, yeah. I didn't get into that, but certainly Joshua Oppenheimer's films as moving images had a real kind of shock to Indonesia, and many of the old guard were panicked as to thinking, wow, my God, the youth are being influenced by this. And so they doubled down on it. And the museum that they built in Jakarta, I mean, Indonesia, the capital city doesn't have a lot of great museums, and the museum that the government poured a lot of money into was the anti-PKI museum. And school kids are taken there all the time. And if you go there pretty much any day of the week, there's a school bus there. And it's a big and spacious and it's quite nice museum. And it's dedicated just to the idea that the PKI was evil. And they have dioramas and life-size figurines and big statues and a bas relief. It's quite a whole complex of images, all dedicated to the idea that PKI was evil. And so after 2015, they started putting even more stuff into that museum to try to say, look, it's real, the PKI was really awful, and that's the message that people get. And so.
I have a small question. Thank you for this interesting talk also. I would be interested, how is the lumbung seen today and in the past in parallel to the communist, to the panic of communism? Was it demonized, or is it still demonized today, or is it still practiced as you are suggesting here in Indonesia?
Yeah. So. Maybe some people with Ruang Rupa could speak about that. My general sort of point on the theme would be that the lumbung as a metaphor for common property of all forms has been, as in most of the rest of the world, been under great attack. And in Indonesia, there used to be a lot of communal land attached to villages that could could be redistributed. And under the new order, under the Suharto regime from 65 to 1998, a lot of these village officials then became unaccountable and sold off the communal land and pocketed the profit. And there was, a lot of profit making going on even at the village level where communal resources were destroyed. Mining companies come in and just create a sacrifice zone, right? Just create a wasteland. And so even people who had been living in a kind of pristine environment, you know the story, it's a kind of global story, are left with the tailings and all the pollution and the destruction of the water resources of the area with the coal mining. And so what I think is important about Rangrupa's contribution is to link into a kind of emphasis of to build upon what common property resources still exist, what kind of forms of commoning, to make it a verb, a commoning still exists. The Communist Party, I think, was, I don't remember any kind of rhetoric of saying we support common property resources, no. but they're saying, we support the peasants, and a lot of the peasants were involved in the land, but that also meant governance at the village level and democratizing that. And in a more democratic system, you can't have these kinds, it's really difficult to have these kinds of mass pollutions, of mass polluting of the resources and mass theft of resources. But if you go to a lot of cities in Indonesia, there's very little green space because so much of it's sold off. Even Jakarta, it used to have a lot of green space. And you go now, it's a carpet of concrete because it's really hard to maintain any common property. It just gets, some official finds a way to sell it off. So that would be my general comment.
Is there a movement to see this in correspondence to our crisis, ecological crisis, at the moment, to bring these old theories of lumbung into the world more, like to sharing ground?
You mentioned that Melanie is going to be coming to speak, right?
Melanie
and that she would be speaking a bit about
the commoning lumbung along the way, which is urban-based lumbung activities. It will be on the 23rd.
So there'll be another talk about it. As I said at the start, it would be interesting to have a longer talk about this, also by people who know more about it than I do. But I mean, the Suharto regime never demonized lumbung or any other kinds of common property practices as bad, but they didn't want it, but they didn't explicitly go after it in their rhetoric or the propaganda. They just promoted officials at all levels of the government to steal as much as they could, and that really they preyed upon property or resources that were not already privately owned or not owned by people who could fight back.
Putra, please. So, yeah.
Yes. Thank you, John, for the insight. Happy to see you in person. I'm from Indonesia. When I arrived here, I come across two concepts, history and guilt. Even though there is a question in me, why guilt in one part of history, but not guilt in other part of history here? But let's go back to Indonesia, as you are a researcher on this topic. I'm curious how, even in Indonesia now, there is still fear if you openly take side with the victims. And at the same time, I feel like there is the absence of guilt. How would you touch upon this absence of guilt in the context of Indonesia? Thanks.
Yeah. Absence of guilt by the perpetrators?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, I'll build upon my earlier comment on Anwar Congo, the main character, and the act of killing, who actually feels guilty. And there are other perpetrators too, who in private will say, you know, at night when it's quiet and they're reflecting on their lives and thinking about whether they're going to get into heaven or not, they will say, you know, what I did was wrong. I can't find a good reason for it. But the continuation of this spirit of anti-communism, the continuation of the propaganda that the PKI was really evil, it sort of reassures them, you know. It's a way of having a collective memory that prevents them from feeling guilty. You know? So there's lots of ways that they can not feel guilty about what they did by projecting all this evil onto some other people. And which is somewhat explains why there's such exaggerated expressions to when the victims do start speaking. It's a real fear, like, wow, people are going to realize what I did was wrong. I can't allow that. It's better if the victims just shut up. Many of the victims themselves were just so desperate. When we interviewed them, they were so desperate to be recognized as good Indonesians. They had been essentially committed nationalists. And that was they had sort of been communists because they were committed nationalists. And to be stigmatized in that way, and to be labeled as anti-national, was like the worst blow for them. And they really wanted just to come out and say, please accept me as... They were willing to tolerate a lot of crap, you know. I mean, they were willing... They didn't make a lot of big demands. They were... But the basic principle that they had after the collapse of the Suharto regime was really just don't discriminate against me and don't treat me as this evil person. Stop the propaganda against me. I was a nationalist. I sacrificed for this nation. I participated in the independence struggle. You know, I did a lot for nation building during the pre-65 period. They just wanted to be recognized as good Indonesians. That was couldn't come out, right? Even that just wasn't allowed by the state. So. Sorry, that's the best I can do for that question.
So since we've been, we have one more comment or question.
Can I,
yeah, David has a, please.
You have a T-shirt to display.
Sorry. I want to refer to the internalized anti-communism in Indonesian society also. Me as a German, I know that there are also continuities in Western German, like in the 50s, 60s, there were like former Nazis used as anti-communists as for fighting in the Cold War. And it's clear now that also in '65 in Indonesia, the German intelligence was involved, and the politics. They just admitted it. Yeah. But the question is, do you think that the omnibus protests in 2020 in Indonesia? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There was a big campaign in the media that the rioters in the protests were anarchists, so anarchists. Mm. Do you think this is a transformation of this anti-communism to everything which is left, mm-hmm. left-winged or protesting?
Yeah. So it's funny that the military in Indonesia has been so preoccupied with being anti-communist. They don't say much about the anarchists, you know. They don't demonize the anarchists as much. Sorry, they don't. But the I mean, there are, of course, young people who sort of ideologically would see themselves as anarchists who would and try to work as activists in that way. But in that first generation, I mean, that's one difference from that first generation of nationalists. The first generation was so concerned with nation building, the idea of creating a state. I mean, all of them were really committed to, like, we don't have a state, and that's why we're the prey of these imperialist forces. In order to fight against imperialism, we need a strong state. And in order to have a strong state, we need to have a kind of unity amongst this nation of all these disparate people. And so there isn't a really strong anarchist tradition on the left in Indonesia. But this is a kind of thing today where, you know, in the face of this kind of continuing permanent army occupation of the country, the state is this oppressive force. And I think Ruang Rupa's ideas about, you know, more horizontal sharing is really important, because I was struck in looking at the exhibits and the books that are coming out with, the drawings. It's always, you know, arrows going horizontally or in circles and so forth. There's never any image of somebody at the top and then branches down, whereas the Indonesian state, the civil bureaucracy as well as the military bureaucracy is that hierarchy of things. And so I see this as a reaction to that environment and trying to, you know, create a more egalitarian politics. And so it would be great if there's more theorization of anarchism within an Indonesian context as well. It would probably be labeled communist as well, but it would be great if there was more theorizations and practices along those lines. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the last comment and question from our friend David. And also, thank you so much for Pak John, John Roosa, for your presentation.
Thank you for inviting me.
John, you wanna give a last remark?
No.
Okay. Okay.
Cukup.
So let's hang out after this.
Yeah. Sure.
So we're going to have a 30 minutes break, and then we'll be John is going to be here around us, and then anyone who want to continue to discuss with him, he doesn't smoke, but he will join us in a smoking area.
Aku pakai masker aja.
Okay. In the next 30 minutes, we're going to have our dear Charles Esche, who will talk about his presentation titled "The First Exhibition of the 21st Century." So don't miss. Have a break for 30 minutes and come back again here in this room. See you in the 30 minutes. Check, 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 check. Uh, we are about to start, and please take a seat or standing. We also have some spaces in the both in the left and the right side. So. Welcome back again. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and good afternoon. Thank you so much again for all of you who are coming back again in this room to attend and then to participate in a conversation we call Let There Be Lumbung. The previous presenter we already had, John Roosa, talk about the moral panic around the image in the Indonesian context, 1965 to the present. And then in a couple of minutes, we are going to have our dear friend Charles Esche, curator, professor on curating, and also director of Vanaba Museums, who's going to talk and present a session titled The First Exhibition of the 21st Century. So what it's looks like, and then what it's all about. Here we invite Charles Esche.
And then encouraged me to say wassalamu alaikum, so I'm happy to say it as well, and to welcome you all here. Also thanks very much to John. I can't see him now, but thanks. Sorry, you're right there. But thanks for sketching such an important history. And also I think it's important to say that that's quite a new narrative that you sketched. It's not something that's been known for many, many decades, even though it goes back many, many decades, all the way to the Dutch attempt at reoccupation in 1945. But in fact, it's something that has only really recently been understood and been analyzed in the way that you did it. So thank you so much, because I think in a way, the story that you told is the story that in the media and in the press, and I think we have to be careful to distinguish between the media and the public reaction to documenta, which has been very different, I think. Almost two worlds, two universes, we could say, if we want to try and get rid of the universal. That in that story in the media was something that was silenced, that was not able to be spoken, because so many other things needed to be spoken for reasons that had very little to do with the people who organized this exhibition or the artworks in this exhibition. And I think it's very important, and I understand completely why Andan invited you to tell that story, because that story puts things into a context which creates the possibility to lead to some kind of understanding which has been refused in the last 95 days, I think. We've still got 5 days to go, so there's still some hope. And maybe I want to touch a little bit on this, because this event is still going, no? There's still 5 days to go. So in a sense, my reflections, which will be much less interesting than John's, because they're not about a reanalysis of a history, but they're about speculations about what this documenta might mean, what it might understand itself to be, or that I understand it to be, and the potentiality which it has released in the world. And they're speculations because this story is unfinished. The story of Documenta 15 is a story that is unfinished in 5 days, in 5 months, in 5 years. I think this will be a profound impact on our thinking. And I guarantee you, in English, when I used to live in England, there was an expression which is that the newspapers are the fish and chip paper of tomorrow. And a lot of what we have read in Der Spiegel and Die Welt and so further is just the fish and chip paper of tomorrow. And, and that what remains for the 5 months and 5 years and longer is the possibility of what Documenta has created and generated for us all. For us also in Europe, for people like me, for my people, white male people, just as much as for many other kinds of people. So I call it the first exhibition of the 21st century, which is, of course, a kind of catchphrase. No, it's a kind of way of encapsulating what the challenge of the documenta might be. And of course, somebody would say, well, you can find precedents in many, many previous exhibitions going into the 20th century and back into the 19th century, actually. But I think rhetorically it helps us to switch our focus from one form, which is a 20th century form, a form that documenta was born into, was generated from the tragedy of the 20th century, and understand that Europe's inability to leave that narrative behind in 2022 is the clash that has been at the core of so much of what has happened, at least as I've seen it in this documenta. It's the refusal to leave the 20th century. I'm going to get 20th and 21st confused all the time. I notice it in my head. It's because I'm too old and I lived the 20th century, you know? but nevertheless, it's the clash between the expectations of the 20th century, the judgments of the 20th century, the prejudices of the 20th century, and the experience of the 21st century, which is what this tension has produced by. And if we can understand it in those terms, not in terms of accusation, not in terms of guilt, not in terms of who should carry the blame, but understand it in terms of two polarized, to some extent, unfortunately, polarized by the society we live in, polarized positions, then maybe we can get to understand the value of this documenta beyond the chip paper, which is in the newspapers. So why do I say century thinking? It's a kind of cliche, and I understand it. I apologize for the cliche, but sometimes cliches are useful. And I think it's interesting maybe to look back at the last 2 centuries very briefly and understand when, I won't go for the whole history, don't worry, but understand when. Yeah, Richard told me that I can only speak for 10 minutes, otherwise I'm too boring. So I'm going to try and keep it short. But if we go back to the 19th century, we see that if we think about the 19th century, what was the generation in artistic terms, and indeed in political terms that the 19th century made, then it was realism to some extent. Yeah, the idea that the world was as it's seen and not as it should be idealized. You know? It wasn't romanticized. So realism was fundamental. And the first time that realism is talked about is in a Mercure Française of the 19th century, calling itself of the 19th century, consciously wanting to invent the 19th century, in 1826. So realism doesn't come to the 19th century until 1826, and yet it becomes the story of art in the 20th century. In the 19th century, what is the story of art in the 20th century? Well, I think we can say the avant-garde. Now, interestingly, and it's a very simple example, there are many examples, there was a gallery opened by Peggy Guggenheim called The Art of This Century. So consciously recognizing the idea that there was a difference between the old century and this century. That was opened in 1942. Quite late. So we could even say that the first exhibition of the 21st century in 2022 is actually pretty early. We can be proud that we've got to the 21st century after only just under a quarter of the 21st century has already passed. So why is it the first exhibition of the 21st century? My understanding, documenta represents at least as big a break with the past as realism and avant-garde modernism did in their centuries. Now, it doesn't mean, in saying this is the first exhibition of the 21st century, that lumbung will come to dominate exhibitions in the future or art from now on, but that a challenge has been laid down to all of us working in the arts, all of us who have some responsibility for what might happen after this event. And it's a challenge which I feel we need to respond to. Not to silence, not to erase, but to respond to. So the question I have personally is what and how to respond to and pay respects to this Documenta 15, and how to plant the seeds that it has generated to create sustainable possibilities. Lumbung makes an offer to all of us in the way we work with art in the world, so that our ways, and when I talk about we, I'm talking about those people that are working in the arts or engaged in the arts. Yeah, it's a big family, but it's still a small family in relation to all those others. To all of us in the way we work in art in the world, so that our ways and means will be more ethically focused, more positioned, more located, more grounded, more collaborative, more meaningful for those beyond that art bubble, who I'm not speaking about here. I'm not when I use the we. But more of those things than it has been in the past few decades. Let's say since 1989, if we want to choose a date that's relevant to the Western art history. But I have to say I'm not really here to think about the consequences of documenta. That's something that I think we need to go away and we need to work on in the next months and the next years, in those 5 months and 5 years. What I want to do here is celebrate with you all, and with ruruHaus and with many of the artists here, and many of the organizers here, to celebrate this exhibition. And to celebrate it and try and understand, at least from my point of view, reflect already before it's closed, reflect on what it has produced, and speculate about what that might mean. So this is why it's not the grounded lecture of John, which I so appreciated, but it's a speculative thinking, which I think can be reshaped and attacked, but we need to start speculating rather than start trying to erase and silence, which is, I think, still what's going on. If you look recently at an article in, I think, Der Spiegel, which says the Documenta 15 is a failure. I mean, this is absurd, no? This definition of this whole extraordinarily important event as a failure shows you the inadequacy of the chip paper of tomorrow. And so, if it's not a failure, then what is it? Why is it the first exhibition of the 21st century? Well, I think there are 3 reasons. Lumbung as a proposition, the fact that it literally ignores the 20th century, and the fact that it is neither realist, which we inherit from the 19th century, and of course continues. These things don't stop, no? Agriculture didn't stop because the Industrial Revolution came along. These things continue. It's neither realist nor avant-garde. So those are the reasons, because it defines itself in opposition to some extent, perhaps sometimes unconsciously, perhaps very consciously at times. It orientates itself away from those very traditions, and I think that's partly where the clash comes from. No? It orientates itself away from the very traditions which this documentary is built on. Now, why do I say I'm going to try and explore those 3 territories a little bit, and then I'm going to try and address the strangeness of the critique which has evolved over the last 95 days. In fact, even earlier, we should remember. So Lumbung, as an idea, as a concept, as a projection, as an imaginative tool. Yeah? So lumbung is not literally a rice bun, we know that. Huh? We see it everywhere. But it's an imaginative tool. And as an imaginative tool, it represents a system change. A system change that we could see perhaps in Immanuel Wallerstein's terms, no? Of world systems and how they shift. It's not a systems change only in the art field. It's a systems change which responds to the conditions of the world and the experiences of the world which we have today. It might become, if it's a paradigm shift, it will become blindingly obvious that this was the only kind of documenta that could be made. People might be standing here in 2042, or whenever that documenta will be, if it's still around, and saying, in 2022, it was very obvious that what was needed was a kind of approach which lumbung, which we all know now, and we know, and that word has become so generic in our vocabulary that people don't even know that it's Indonesian. Yeah? That process is precisely the process that lumbung represents. It is a moment where what was impossible yesterday became obvious today. How does lumbung do this? It challenges some of the fundamentals of what modernist art and the modernist structure, the modernist infrastructure of art has set up since the late 19th century. It does this by challenging the notion of the commercialism of art through the art gallery system. One of the innovations, which is not spoken about enough, is the lumbung gallery. And as somebody who has a collection and who buys art, we are going to do our damnedest to buy as much as we can through the lumbung gallery in the future. And that needs to be defended, because it offers a different kind of circulation of cash. It offers the possibility, at least for public institutions, to reuse that cash so that it supports the system that we believe in, and not reuse the cash to support the system of the super rich and the 1%, which is what most of the gallery system is dedicated to. They might do good shows, they might do bad shows, they might work with good artists, they might work with bad artists. The infrastructure of that system is dedicated to the 1%. And lumbung is not. That's a systems change, potentially. Yeah? This is the potential it has. It created the conditions, and I know this as a museum director, it created the conditions where money could be used in locations which had no direct impact on Kassel. Money was sent, you did it, money was sent from here to Kenya to create possibilities, events, not documenta visiting and coming down with the holy grail of the documenta and Western civilization and all that and saying we're going to do something in Kenya because we know what it's about. No, that would be internationalism. No, that would be some kind of export industry. Yeah, but this was money, resources, which can be turned into anything, as we know, mostly. The limitations of money would be another lecture, no? But that was used by the people who were there in order to create their own events, their own energies, their own possibilities. Yeah? That diversion of money, which I think should lead to a paradigm shift in which that is what all public institutions need to think about. What do we give back when we invite an artist to come to us? What do we return? What do we allow to happen in another place when we extract, if you want, those artworks from elsewhere to our institution? That conversation never happened before. Or if it did happen, it was dismissed. I remember when Lumbung first proposed the idea that money should be sent elsewhere, it wasn't that, it's quite a bad idea, or we're not sure about that. No, what was the answer? It's illegal. Yeah? The legal system was what was being challenged. Yeah, it wasn't any director's fault. It wasn't the responsibility of an individual who said, no, of course, it's a great idea, brilliant, marvelous, but it's illegal. And fighting from that illegality to the reality that it happened was a huge effort. And let's not underestimate the effort that Rowan Grupa and the artists and everyone else took to make that systems change possible. And when you say, well, what were they doing? Okay, I need to be fast. I can see Richard falling asleep, actually. It introduced the idea that the art world does not have to be competitive. That's not the only model. No? The model of sharing, and if you think about Eric Beltran's, he's here somewhere, Eric, at the print shop, no? That took a slice of every money that was offered to every artist and gathered it together and made that amazing project with some amazing prints, including one by Richard Bell, actually, recently that I saw, which was quite extraordinary. Two. I've only got one, you see. But look at what that does, yeah? That's against the nature of what the art world is set up to be, which is a vicious law of the jungle competition for the best aesthetic expression of the modern soul. That's the art world. No? And artists, students, are taught to fight each other like cats and dogs, like tigers and lions, to be at the top. And Lumbung comes along and says, no, actually, you can give money to each other and you can kind of exchange and actually you can get something else out of it. That's a systems change, no? That's something that changes what was impossible yesterday and makes it possible today. I've got other points, but I'm not sure. It's not neoliberal. It's not grounded on the idea of neoliberalism. It's not about flexibility and the creativity of the artist to solve the situations that the art world imposes on them. It's a really difficult wall. It's kind of angled at 45 degrees, and it doesn't actually work, and you can't put a projection on it. But go on, you're an artist, solve that problem. Yeah, the problems that the art world creates, that's not what this has been about at all. It's not been about a set of refined aesthetic solutions to problems that the infrastructure of art has set up through establishing the kind of exhibition it does, or whatever. No. It's not that. It's actually, I think in the message, I think in what I see in this exhibition, it's about striving for a steady state. It's not about growth. It's not about change. It's not about endlessly getting bigger, faster, fatter. Yeah? It's about survival, but survival with resistance. Survival which points to another way of being, another systems of value, which are not the values that are inherited or constructed by the very system that you're serving. It's about proposition and adaptation. What's fascinating for me, and I was brought up in the 90s, more or less, I came to start practicing. And criticality was the tool that we had. If we wanted to say on the left, I would have once said that. I'm very doubtful of that anymore. Criticality was the tool that we had. We sort of pointed at things and said, look, this is wrong, wrong, it's wrong. Who's going to fix it? Oh, the government. Huh? Who's going to fix it? The powers that democracy provided for us to fix things. And our job was to point at these things and then ask that government to fix them. Yeah, 30 years on, was that a really good strategy? Was that something that really paid off? Yeah, was criticality enough? Of course it was needed. It's not to erase it. Yeah, we're not talking about erasure at any point. No one should be erased. No idea should be erased. But is it enough? Is it enough to build a steady state, degrowth economy? Is it enough to be a society where we can live well rather than get better? Is it enough to be critical? And I think that lumbung, by being propositional, by being adaptive, offers another way of addressing criticality. If you like, to practice as resistance, to practice as being critical, not to point, but to do. Make friends, not art. And I think Philip talked beautifully yesterday, I heard about it's not about making friends and no art. It's about making friends, building infrastructure, building the constructions which can make that art possible. What you see in those exhibitions is there's so much art, no? But the art is a byproduct of another process. Now, that's exactly true of the Museum of Modern Art or the Louvre. No, it's just we don't see that other process because they've stripped it all out. They've purified it. They've got rid of it. And they've just said, here's the art on a plinth. Here's the art that's standing in front of you on the wall or next to you. Here's the Venus de Milo, but we're not going to talk about how it came here, what it did. They're beginning, of course, museums are reforming. But nevertheless, that essential idea of stripping out the friends and just focusing on the art is what the problem is. So make friends, not art, is saying we need infrastructure and we need our infrastructure. We need an infrastructure that is sympathetic to the way that we think. We need a friendly infrastructure before we can make art. Otherwise, there is no art. So it's true. Make friends, not art. That's where you need to start. Second reason, this is going too slow, I'm sorry. Yeah. Can you tell me? Yeah, yeah, okay. This exhibition literally ignores the 20th century. Those histories are no longer central, significant, even very present. And I think this is one of the reasons for the conflict. There's a time scale, a timeline, which I inherited, which Western Europeans, which white men inherited of the 20th century. Let's forget about the first half of the 20th century. It goes 1945, 1968, 1989, and then the end of history and neoliberalism and finish. Yeah? That's the history that we had. This looks at that history and goes, what are you talking about? That's not our history. Sometimes I think that part of the problem is that it's almost intolerable for some people in the German media to register the fact that the Second World War for Indonesia was about the Dutch and the Japanese. There were no Germans. There was nothing German about the Second World War in Indonesia. But we can't hear that here, no? Or it's really hard to hear it here. John's story is hard to hear because it's not the narrative that we know and we believe should be the ground on which all other documenters have been based, yeah? All other documents base themselves on 1945. Everything goes back to that originary point. And it just goes, yeah, I mean, yeah, of course, it's important. We don't not acknowledge it. The woman who was here earlier spoke beautifully about the connections between that war and this current condition. But we're in 2022. And if we say we still have to solve the problem of 1933 to 1945, we're going to ignore a huge amount of what's needed, what we need to survive, what we need to adapt, what we need today. Of course, that needs to be respected. But like criticality, that's not enough. It's not enough. And that's where this exhibition by starting without the 20th century as its ground zero, creates the possibility to be the first exhibition of the 21st century. Is that a hint that I should finish, actually? Okay, so its best moments in this exhibition, its best moments, and it has good and it has bad moments, like anything, no? That's normal. Its best moments are neither realist nor avant-garde, which have been, more or less, the main poles of artist discourse. Yeah, and I know I'm being way too simplifying, but more or less the poles of artist discourse. Think about abstract expressionism and socialist realism in the Cold War, no? So these things have been more or less the poles which have governed our art of the last century. Instead, it presents, for the first time that I know of, and I'm happy to be corrected here, the idea of the society in which it's responding to, not as a problem to be solved. Let's take the climate catastrophe as an example, but we could talk about many other things that need to be responded to, no, in 2022, but that's quite a big one. No, it's about essential survival. It's about whether there is going to be not just another documenta, but whether there's going to be another Kassel. Now, it's not a problem to be solved, a crime to be decried, the wagging finger, the criticality of pointing, or a campaign to be won in a political process. But really, an inevitability. It's already happened. I sometimes think, but this is over-exaggerating, no? But this is a post-apocalyptic exhibition. This is an exhibition after this has happened. And the question is not to decry it or criticize it or campaign to change it, but to deal with it. Harsh and difficult though that might be to say, we have to deal with what we've done. We can't unmake what we've done. We can't change what we've done. People have tried. The last 40 years, Shell and Exxon and BP knew in the 1970s that this was the end of the world, and they did nothing about it. So our position is not able, our criticality, our resistance in the political sense is not able to do anything. So how do we deal with it? And that's what you see in this exhibition. For instance, whereas realism would bemoan and critique the situation, or celebrate it, and that's the kind of leftist view, you know, it's all really bad, right? One, oh, we can solve it with technological solutions. Whereas the avant-garde would demand action and protest against the generators of carbon dioxide. But that action and protest would go nowhere because the supporters are far stronger than the resistors. Or, in a more positive sense, well, maybe more conservative left, portray it as a universal utopian, portray that there's a possible universal utopian revolutionary solution, revolution, which can solve it. But it seems to me that in many cases, the installations and artworks here, the catastrophe of climate change simply joins the catastrophe that was and is colonialism and coloniality, the catastrophe that was and is modernity, and the catastrophe of so many already committed and sanctioned genocides around the world. It joins those. That's the inevitability that we have to accept. Those things have already happened. John mentioned the word genocide and then avoided it, and I'm going to avoid it as well in other terms. But for this moment, if there have been genocides in the world, they've been committed. The question is perhaps, for us, not to do it again. That's not a bad question to ask, no? It's not about the guilt of your grandparents or your parents or whatever, or your great-grandparents. But let's not do it again. But having happened, how do we go on? How do we move as a society when those have happened across the world? It is despite these histories, not in agreement with them or in opposition, that many of the artists and participants here choose to act. I can give numerous examples, from Wajuku in the informal suburbs of Nairobi to the Rojava Film Collective, to Project Artworks, to Inland, and so on. I think it's also sometimes the reason that there's resistance is that, I know Richard's sitting here, but I did write this before I knew he was going to be here, but you know, every documenter tries to write a canon. Yeah? Every documenter tries to canonize certain positions. The canon is not something to be afraid of, it's something to rewrite, it's something to change, it's something to make sure that it's applicable for that moment and then move on and find another one. But if you have, let's say, an example, I think this is not true. If you have Dan Pajowski, Tanya Bruguera, and Richard Bell as the canon, as the spirits that float above an exhibition, and you turn that to a group of people who still think that Joseph Beuys is the person that does social sculpture, and still think that the representation of 1970s or the 1990s in relational aesthetic is actually what's going on here. If you have that dialogue, what are you going to talk about? How can you put those two things together if nobody listens to Tanya or Richard or Dan, and Joseph Beuys is out with the trees and the stones on the streets, but not inside Documenta 15? How do we talk, man? And I'm going to come back to that. So these artists are simply acting in the present, trying to live well. Not live better, but live well. That's always a nice decolonial concept, no? Let's try and live well with each other, not improve. Let's just live well. This is not defeatist or cynical at all, but it is about making practical, grounded propositions about how best to act and how to live ethically in a world in which almost all the actions of the capitalist system cause pain to humans and devastation to the planet. I'm tempted here to quote a little bit Rolando Vasquez, who's a wonderful decolonial theorist, where he says, "Can we live an ethical life in a world in which our well-being and sense of self is implicated in the suffering of human and non-human others and the extraction of Earth? Can we live an ethical life?" He doesn't answer that. I'm not going to answer it. Documenta doesn't answer it. But what it is, I see this exhibition as the first that addresses that question. Can we lead an ethical life in the face of human suffering and devastation of Earth? Can we lead that? Is the question that surely must become the key issue of the 21st century? Surely. And Documenta asks that question. It doesn't answer it. It asks that question pluralistically, plurally, answering in many ways that are fit for different places, but cannot be directly translated. There's no universal solutions here. It does so poetically, artistically, aesthetically, socially, and politically, all at the same time often. Not the separation that modernism would ask us to impose on the practices of artists, the practices of people in other disciplines. No, but it does it all at the same time. It does so without the modern Western European arrogance to believe that one faith, the scientific rationalism of modernity, can answer everyone's situation as long as those everyone's become as much like Western Europeans as possible. So in ending my 30 minutes, I need to go back to the question of the aggressive criticism of Documenta, especially here in Germany. Perhaps given the challenge it issues to much cherished modern values, including guilt, of the 20th century, no one should be particularly surprised. If you simply ignore a people's historical myths, if you refuse to make an exhibition that is tailored to what Germany wants to believe it is, if you propose that it's time for other people who are not from here to take the center stage, then you're going to get a backlash. And I was talking recently to some people about that this is stony ground for lumbung. It's not ground which receives the seeds of lumbung very easily. And perhaps that's true. But the stony ground is where also, given the catastrophes of coloniality, the catastrophes of climate change, the stony ground is what we have all over the world. We don't have a friendly environment anymore. There's a beautiful book by N.K. Jemisin which talks about the future as the concept of Mother Earth has changed to Father Earth, and that Father Earth is a disciplinary figure. Father Earth is angry with the humans that occupy it. And I think that transition is a very interesting one to speculate about. So sowing on stony ground is what we've got, and we need to sow it on stony ground. And I'm not sure the ground is so much more, and John pointed it out, is not so much kinder to those seeds in Indonesia than it is here. There is not an ideal. I'm not going to do agricultural metaphors too much. No, that's all right. Sorry. I think one of the reasons for these reactions is what I wanted to try and think about. Why was this reaction? And I think that Corona unquestionably contributed. But it's an even more virulent plague, I think, that has taken over the last years and has a longer history, but a history of the 21st century. And that's the massive manipulation and polarization of opinion through digital media. This has had a profound effect on the psychology of the audiences and critics for documenta and reduced dramatically the capacity for listening and embracing difference. Let me illustrate with one example, and will you bear with me? There's a couple of quotes here that are a bit long, but I think they're important because they talk a little bit about the German situation and the change or the reasons for the change even. In 2016, the late Okwien Weso organized a very important exhibition in Munich called Post-War. In the extensive book, he wrote these words: "The Holocaust and the camps were natural consequences of the extensive development and deployment of the technologies of race, bureaucracy, and violence. As Hannah Arendt pointed out, these instruments were already developed within the institutions of the colonial state, where early prototypes of concentration camps and mass killings were first conceived and tested. The acknowledgement of the dialectical relationship between colonialism and violence complicates any sense of the uniqueness of the Holocaust." I'm quoting here, yeah? That's not my words. I'm quoting something that was published in a renowned German museum exhibition hall in 2016. Now, that was published without complaint in 2016. And what is even more surprising, given what we now know, is that if you turn to the frontispiece of that book, you find the patron's statement. And it goes as follows, a little extract, but please listen to this. "Post-war, the exhibition makes possible a change of vantage points and introduces us to things of which we were previously unaware. Both are urgent necessities, changing vantage points and making us aware of things that we were previously unaware of. Both are urgent necessities because in politics, and it's a politician speaking, but also elsewhere, to insist that one is in possession of the absolute truth only leads to deadlocks and conflicts. If we want peaceful global development to have a chance, we must all strive to acquaint ourselves with the different perceptions of the same reality. Only if we succeed in accepting different viewpoints and then uniting them in dialogue will we succeed in true mutual understanding." I'm almost tempted to say, isn't that we need to talk? Art, freedom, solidarity? Isn't that what that was all about? Accepting different viewpoints and then uniting them in dialogue, we will succeed in true mutual understanding. In a world that seems to be coming apart at the seams, cultural politics has a decisive role to play in this process, both inside and outside our country. We must learn to see the whole picture. Those words were written by Franz-Walter Steinmeier, the current president of Germany. Franz-Walter Steinmeier, the person who opened this exhibition, refusing to name documenta, refusing to name the people in documenta, refusing to thank the people in Ruangruppe, refusing to thank the artists, and opening the exhibition with entirely a speech about the question that we know has dominated the German media since that moment. So what happened between 2016 and 2022? What happened? Because if you can write that, or somebody can write it for you, in 2016, then why does somebody write for you the speech that he introduced to the exhibition in 2022? Well, Steinmeier did become president, as the German people here know, so perhaps when he saw Trump, and he saw Orban, and he saw Johnson, and he saw Bolsonaro, he felt a little bit lonely. Thought he could take on the male autocratic states by having a dig at culture. No, I'm joking, but I think the influence of those people on politicians has been quite profound. We should be a little bit more like Bolsonaro, no? They can imagine them saying in their private quarters. But I think more than anything, another level, another switch of the polarization of society has happened. the reserves of social resilience and the desire to listen and learn to see that whole picture have been simply consumed by big media, with the knowledge of big media is doing this, creating the bubbles which refuse to be penetrated by other bubbles. And no doubt, this has been combined and accelerated and reinforced, like concrete around the bubble, no? Reinforced by the pandemic and by the isolation that has produced. While we might, as a world society, recognize that we're in recovery from Corona, well, but sometimes I think we just want to ignore it. Sometimes I think we just want to say it never happened. But it's profoundly changed our interpersonal relationships at many, many levels. The trust is gone. Yeah? Corona defeated trust, and we have to build mutual trust from the ground up. But we don't recognize it. But we do recognize that we need to recover in some way. Mostly economically, because that's the only way that politicians can think, and the media really focuses on that. But I think also spiritually, ethically, we're in recovery. But the polarization that social media produces hasn't even been generally diagnosed yet. We can't even recover for something because we don't actually recognize that that's what's going on. Perhaps this is more so, I have to say, in the closeted west of Europe than anywhere else. The sense of precarity and vulnerability that Corona brought for people that had hardly ever felt it before in their lives. Because security has been here, in this place, more or less since the end of the 1950s. And that fear, that existential fear, that maybe it's not going to be the same for the next 70 years, does produce the inhospitable, angry, self-obsessed response to documenta and to much else. This is as true for so-called Western intellectual discourse as it is for the self-righteous anger that greets us on Twitter. What I mean is, to put it bluntly, the so-called scientific committee that wrote a very strange and rather unthought and unscientific report, as has been mentioned in the media, that accused, and many of our colleagues, I have to say, also around the world, are just as subject to the effect of polarization as the trolls on Twitter. This is trolling by scientific committee. This is what is going on. Not anything else. And we have to be able to perceive that before we can talk, before we can come, as President Steinmeier wanted us in 2016, to see the whole picture and to create a dialogue. Now, I just want to finish here with a little bit of a personal confession, I think. I mean, it's hard in this process, in these criticisms, in the German press reaction, even in the early German press reaction, because this resistance to ruruHaus began early, the first visits of journalists to Jakarta, in the first response to the appointment. Who are these people? They're not going to be able to do it. I have to say also, and being involved in the finding committee and understanding that ruruHaus were put under enormous pressure because people didn't quite believe that you could produce an exhibition. How many conversations did we have when they said, but it's all going to be empty, they're just talking. Go out there. Is it empty? But why did the mentality say, this method won't deliver what we need, so you need to do our methods. You need to take what we know, our infrastructure, and forget about your knowledge, forget about the context of Indonesia, forget about all that, become like us, become everybody. Yeah? And then we can help you, then we can welcome you, then we can give you all the money you like. But don't be yourselves. That seems to have been the process that happened from beginning to end. And the last thing I want to say really is, as I say, a little bit personal, because it's difficult to avoid the conclusion or the understanding that what we're facing is a calcified Europe. A Europe that is not able to move anymore. And we know what happens with calcification. First, things become rigid, things become immovable, rules and protocols become laws and become doctrine. And then it breaks. That's what happens. When a bone calcifies, at some point, you just pick it up and it's dust. And it's hard not to avoid, or it's hard to avoid that conclusion. But I think, and I'm speaking here to people who are not my people, not white men, well, for a moment, let's understand, at least a little bit, that my people had total power over the world for 500 years. We could do anything we wanted, and everyone had to listen. We never had to listen back. Yet we never recognized that privilege. We always thought that by fighting each other, we were fighting the whole world. We had difficulties, of course, but we had complete power over everything beyond ourselves. Women, people of color, non-human lives, the natural world, the whole caboodle. And this is now radically changing for the better. But it's hard to let that sense of power and entitlement go. And we need to find ways to allow that letting go of that dominant position to happen if we're to avoid what is happening in the media in Germany. And we want to avoid it, because what documenta means is so much more than this stupid fight about white male power. And we need that to stop. Documenta is neither realist nor avant-garde. It ignores the 20th century. It pleases neither right nor left. For the right, it's not concerned with celebrating wealth and providing material for the market. For the left, it challenges the cultural values, and it's not utopian revolutionary enough. I think that's because it is the first exhibition of the 21st century, and I suspect that the 21st century will not be a division between left and right. I suspect that when we look back, when I'm dead, maybe some of you will be alive, a few of you, you'll look back at the 21st century and say, what happened to that left-right thing? That's a really interesting historical moment, no? It began in the French Revolution, and it's kind of come to an end. As Walter Mignolo, the great decolonial theorist, said, quite recently actually, he said, we are no longer living in an era of changes. That was modernity. We're living in a change of era. And if we survive, I want to thank Ryan Gruper, the artists, the documenta team who worked incredibly hard on this and really deserve incredible plaudits for making this possible under the most extreme conditions. All the team that's worked up here, all the team that works elsewhere, everybody who's contributed to this. I want to thank you for giving us the first taste of what the rest of the century might be. Thank you very much. Thank you. Anda?
Thank you.
Buck.
Thank you. Ade, are you? Do we have Ade or Reza or anyone from Rupa? Please join us.
Reza, Ade.
Is there Ade around us? Ajeng, Daniela, and everyone from us, please join us.
There.
Enggak ada Asun. Sarjul, Ameng, and also we have our dear friend and also
Sari?
Gertrude Flenke.
Pak Bos.
Do you have Ajeng? Oh, and Daniela. Any question?
Sama-sama, sama-sama. Sama-sama.
Please, Richard, you wanna say something?
It was too long.
Is this on? Is this on? Is this working? Okay. Oh, thank you, Charles, for such a short speech. It was very much to the point and really uplifting for us here. I'd like to thank Ron Gruper for the magnificent job that they've done. My question, though, was about the finding committee. Like in all this, you know, the first exhibition of the 21st century, the finding committee are going to look like geniuses. So the question is, how do you deflect that attention and praise to the rightful owners of that?
Sorry. Do we have Esche, Gulesh, and Andrea Linenkol around us? If yes, please join us.
It's a great question, and I think firstly to say that I think for all of us on the finding committee, I can speak for myself, this way surpassed anything that we imagined could have happened when that selection made. And the other thing that's very important, I think, to realize is that we did not have any involvement whatsoever in this documenta. Yeah, we made a choice, and that ended our role. And we were asked occasionally to support the translation of things that happened. But it was a job of translation, no? And I think that Rowan Grupa can support that. We, as a finding committee, have different opinions about it. Gabi is here as well. She can maybe help me to answer. Yeah. But we have nothing to do, and no credit is needed for us at all. It was a coincidence. We got lucky. Yeah? We got lucky. And that was all that the only thing that we can claim is that somebody was shining on us when we made the decision. That's all. And I don't want to claim anything else. And I wouldn't. Thanks.
Any comments or questions?
Hi, well, thank you, Charles Esche, for making us all tear up. That was really beautiful speech. I have a speculative question. I don't think it's a very important question, but it's been nagging on me in the past few days. It's a question about place and materialization, especially if we think of, you know, this being Lumbung 1 and Lumbung going on after Documenta 15. And I just wonder, I think it was really important for Lumbung 1 to materialize in Kassel. Although as a German citizen, I really apologize and feel ashamed with what happened with all the media discourse. But still, I think it was important that it happened here with everything that it, you know, took with it because of the calcification and shaking things up. But since this was the first exhibition of the 21st century, I'm wondering, where should the second exhibition of the 21st century happen?
You know, one thing I think that they've done extraordinarily well, and one thing that you know, people in Kassel shouldn't underestimate, is the financial support that has made this possible. Because I mean, in a way, it's not much money. You know, if you divide it over 5 years, it's less money than in major museum institutions. You know, if Kassel had an even bigger museum, it would cost them 10 million a year, and in 5 years, they'd be spending the budget that they spend here, and with just having a sort of middle-sized, in a way, museum, no? So it's not that much in absolute terms. But what it is it focuses all that resource onto 100 days. So all that resource, which isn't very much for us, is focused on that single event. And maybe that's the lesson to take. The lesson to take is that the resourcing of Documenta allowed the vision that ruruHaus had 20 years ago, because this isn't new. This isn't something they invented. It's something that they were living with all the time, a process that they worked with all the time. But those resources allowed that to take this scale and to take this stage. And so I would say not where is it, because in some senses it doesn't matter that much. Maybe not in Germany, but when and how is it? You know? When, in terms of that time period, and not trying to spread it out so that it's too long and then everything gets diluted, and how are you going to enable the notion of hospitality, which is at the core of the invitation. Yeah, I mean, we can ask questions about German hospitality afterwards, but the core was a notion of hospitality that was given to the idea that ruruHaus should come and make an exhibition in Kassel, and that core of hospitality could be maintained. So if you have hospitality and you have focus in resources, I'm not asking for more resources, but focus, then I think it doesn't matter where. But where would be absolutely determining of what. Yeah, absolutely determining of what. But it doesn't matter. The where would be the place that it needs to be, because that the how and the resources are there. The when and the how are there. There you got a question.
Anybody want to have a?
Yeah. Yes, Jack. Can you hear? Yeah. Just maybe you want to add or react to Charles, actually, because what I personally, or maybe also my friends, are really looking forward is the process of reflecting after this, or harvesting, and the question on how this learning can actually be shared. So that will enable the lumbung to sustain also other places, maybe. Can be small also, no need to be always a mega event like this. And what is more important, that is interconnected.
Yeah, that's why we have mini majlis.
Yeah, for example.
Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, like, thank you, Charles, for labeling this thing. I mean, like, we don't really care about that kind of shit. I mean, like, we're going to, I think, like, some media will put us in the how you call it, the power list #1. I mean, like
Power 100.
You know, like this. You know, like we're going to go back and then busy again. I think like everyone in the all lumbung artists will, after this, will go back to our own context, locality, struggles, and so on. I think one thing that really, for me, that is really happy is actually that conversation is actually happening. The gathering, the conference, so I'm really looking forward. I mean, like, I can stop anytime, actually, not 100 days, 90 days, or tomorrow or something. I think that point taken, and also the conversation, it's been done beautifully, and it's not a simulation. It's really real, and of course, like hearing all the claps, it's uplifting, it's touching, but also at the same time, if we go back to, you know, all the ideas, the initial ideas that we have, we still have a lot of homework dealing with management, dealing with all the artists' realities back home and so on. So it's hopefully it's not going to be just like covered by this sort of like beautiful recognition, which is also very important. But you see, like back home, you know, we will go back to that real struggles. And I think if you really would like to see this as a journey, I think that will be the real lumbung journey, is actually after this. So I would say like the 21st centuries, what is it?
Forget it.
I forgot it already. Yeah. Sorry. I think that will be like, for us, is actually the most important is actually what's after. I'm really looking forward to, or we all like really looking forward what's actually coming after. I think this is for the first time maybe the exhibition, it's sort of like being used as sort of like as a journey to go beyond itself. I think that's actually the one that really much important for us. You know, all the connection, all the ripples, all the spiraling out connection and conversation that it should be happening after. And we don't really think that it's going to be sort of like one, like a lumbung singular universals application or ideas that it should be taken by all. I think like everyone should also like really adapt and also speculate on a certain localities, and we're going to like really connect and reconnect towards after that. I think that will be the most interesting one. But it is like our journey and our translation or exhibition here is very important, because this is for the first time that really coming together and really in conversation, the direct conversation with all the contexts and all different models. I think we're really looking forward actually after this. Thank you.
Super.
Yeah, Catherine, please.
Well, I just have one thing, preoccupation. How can we translate the word lumbung in all the languages that we speak? Because there's one thing I'm afraid about, that we'll pronounce it too often, and it will, in a way, disappear before it can grow. Because this happened to a lot of new things that we try to implement, whether it's fair practice, whether it's the word ecology, for example. It's being misused within no time. And this is my biggest preoccupation, that we will lose the word lumbung and all its meaning before we can act it. So let's find a lot of words for lumbung so it doesn't get lost.
Nice.
A word as a verb, not as a noun or adjective, but as a verb.
It's a verb.
Yeah, it's a verb, not a noun nor adjective. Yeah. Nor imperative,
You're
of course.
Translate in Dutch.
Yeah, I just wanted to react to that, and also to what was said before. Thank you also, Charles, for the uplifting. Indeed, that was also very much part of the first year, I think, when we were really building lumbung, like thinking about Maya, that you can see in the space of festivals in Indonesia, Buen Vivir, like all these kind of forms of maybe in European language commoning. And I mean, all the work that we haven't done, no? Like we were intentional of creating a book about the cosmologies of all these forms, because yeah, before you know, it all becomes the commons, or, oh, let's all be in collective practice. So this is a work that needs to be done, and I think Sari is also referring to that when speaking about harvesting, no? Like, how can we make sure? So also, when Ade says, I think, not to make it more beautiful, the exhibition of the 21st century, I think we are still in this one. And I feel also like it's still going to end abruptly as a system, no? As Documenta is as a system, most of the stuff will go 1st of October. And all the learning that we still need to do and still need to harvest, for that not to happen, I think, is really important. So it's also a call back to Documenta. I think not only for this edition, but future editions, to, like as Charles was saying, like a lot has gone to the local previously. We are here in Kassel, but actually the idea was always it would go back to the local, and this, I think, is not healthy yet in the system here. So we need to work on that as well, besides the fact that we will continue anyway, but in precarity with a group of people that is quite burnout, all the artists that have been distracted from their localities because of these fights in the media and the work. So, yeah, just wanted to thank the artists as well for...
And also, we want to thank to our friends who has been starting living here since June 2020 with families, Reza, Vicina, and Iswanto. Yeah. Yeah, so also thanking their families who have been with them all the time since June 2020. Also, thank you, Charles, for thanking us.
It was about time,
Yeah.
maybe.
Any question?
Yeah, hello. Thank you for the beautiful speech. Also, Charles, Solva, I'm over here. I'm standing here.
Sorry.
Hi. It's a question to you all, actually, because I'm curious if there are some concrete strengths that carry the project further in different directions. Like, is there anything from the lumbung that will continue that you know of at this point without promising anything? Like, for example, Charles, you mentioned the gallery as an invention. I mean, is there a chance that this can sustain and go on? And just to sense the future of things and possibilities, if there's anything concrete.
Yeah, this talk, Let There Be Lumbung, as a talk series platform, will be continued after 100 days. So see you somewhere with this Let There Be Lumbung talk series. Anyone to answer? Yeah.
Okay. You get it back. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. It's quite. I mean, like other also can add because yeah, during the process of these two years, there's a lot of majlis akbar which usually even participated by 150 to 200. All the lumbung communities in Zoom, and we did it like several times, and mini majlis as well. So it's like. And then it's developed actually several projects that we all envision, which actually is not even evident actually in the exhibition. Really go beyond documenta actually. Just like to name a few, and the other can add. Like there is a working group of lumbung kiosks, which is really actually dealing with how production of small unit business in many initiative in the lumbung communities is actually sort of like connected. And then lumbung gallery, of course, it's still really ongoing project. We're going to see that what's actually come after documenta 15, and then we have lumbung press. Fred can add on this. We have lumbung network, which is Lumbung publisher as well, small, not small, like medium independent publisher from really from different ecosystem as well, and also a Lumbung land, which is really dealing with about a common land in the how really the needs about the space and also about the land in different localities, which is actually necessary, and also how we can really go beyond sort of in connection with the other than sort of like ownership of property. And then also there is a Lumbung, there's a working group of currency as well, because there is several practice or initiative that really on to that as well. Good School Inland and ZKU also like and question of funding as well, talking or like really inspiring group as well. It's not really evident, for example, this discussion in the exhibition, but it's actually happening as well. You want to add on Lumbung land, maybe?
I want to add on non-Lumbung, since that, because these are kind of the bigger collective efforts that many people have been gathering around, but we had a collective pot of money and resources, care, networks, and so on. So there's also many other connections, like I saw Esche here from Good School that's working with people from Festival sur le Niger to create a Lumbung Maya curriculum. There is in the Lumbung Interlocal a small fund that has kind of supported connections between people from artists from the ecosystems in the Lumbung Interlocal to start collaborating. So this is things that we don't see and that are happening and that will definitely live on. And since we have this structure of assemblies, mini majlises, we will remain in touch, like not everyone. Some people might hate it and are happy that finally they are not there anymore, but I think the majority, and also all the stress from the media has also created maybe even deeper relations with a lot of pain, but still the friendships will continue as well, I think.
And maybe I can add just one thing, because I think it's very right that you talk about all these initiatives, but the Lumbung and Documenta 15 is an offer to the rest of the world, and you shouldn't be responsible for carrying that offer. Yeah, we all need to carry that offer. We all need to be part of it. And so when we say, you know, it's wrong to look at ruruHaus and say, well, what are you going to do with Lumbung? No, Lumbung is something, and the commoning makes it very clear, no? This is our responsibility if you choose to take it. And if you choose to take it, then if it is this ridiculous idea of the first exhibition of the 21st century, which I apologize for as well, but I did apologize for it. But if it is that, then there's going to be many, many more. No, there's going to be many exhibitions in the 21st century. This is just the start. And you won't be the people directing and controlling that, thank God. Yeah? We will all be doing that. So it's an offer which we need to receive. And that reception has, of course, been very, very noisy, let's say, blocked in terms of the noise that's been sent around it. But that reception is what's crucial, I think. And that will make Lumbung work. And you do everything you can, but we need to do everything we can as well, and together and in common. Yeah. There's a question over there.
You have a question? Yeah. So.
What did you say? That's a good question. Stop being Van Abbe, no?
Thank you, ruruHaus. I think I just want to make this point because Germany is a country, it's a very, very like to take the ownership. I think this kind of movement, what we're seeing now in front of, because I guess the people who are sitting in front of, especially ruruHaus sitting in the podium, it's actually work of a lot of people who committed here, especially like the black movements in Germany and all over the global scale. So it's like, it's not that Germany had a goodwill to bring the the Global South collective to bring here and like try out something. I think because I'm afraid in future Germany will claim, okay, look at us, we brought the like one of greatest collective here, and so because I think it's important to rename it. It's not because they're goodwill. Actually, it was like last 20 years, people like like Samraerta, and who gave their life to this struggle in this country to bring this movement to us. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello. Oh.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you
Okay.
loud and clear, safe and sound.
Okay, so I'm from Israel. I'm sorry to ruin the party. I just wanted to ask because I'm kind of from the more left, let's say, community, the art community in Israel. You know, we're kind of aware that there's a silent boycott of Israel. I'm just thinking out loud with you, like, I know it's difficult to talk about it, but if there's anything we can kind of, I don't know, discuss, because being boycotted is, you know, I don't have to explain, it's very difficult because there's no way to kind of, you know, to discuss different perspectives, as Charles said. So we're kind of out of the picture. And I just wanted to put this in because I think, you know, it's a really interesting moment, kind of euphoric for you. But at the same time, you know, for a certain public in Israel, it's a pretty dramatic moment. We kind of figure out that the future of, you know, of Israeli artists and curators. I'm a curator. To be involved in, you know, global exhibitions is pretty low in the moment and probably much lower in the future. So I just wanted to ask, like, if there's anything you can say about that.
Who's that to? Sorry. Who's the question to?
Oh, who's the question to? Whoever wants to pick it up. I'm sure that you're not going to fight about it, so...
Thank you. I think I thought we made it very clear in our statement that there is no silent boycott. I mean, like we can accuse of Documenta silent boycotting Indonesia because there's never been Indonesian artists in the Documenta history.
Since 1955, and it doesn't mean Documenta hits us.
But it's not that point. I mean, it's just like I think we are very clear that it's not a representational nation, representational approach of show or exhibition or project, and like the whole thing of the lumbung ideas or concepts makes really change our actually approach in doing also artistic research. You know, like it's more conversational. It's not, we're not even really talk too much about works, for example, because there is no theme on this exhibition. So it's like really on how it work, and also with values. And then so we really having different conversation towards how artists in a certain localities is actually dealing with their ethics, collectivities, their own local ecosystems, and so on and so forth. So it's like really we're researching about like how they practice actually, rather than how even like it's not about like what they produce or like what they're creates. Not so much about that. So it's really on on that notes or approach. So there is no silent boycott such a thing. Actually, I just like would like to make it like very clear on that. And yeah. So of course we can discuss that afterwards. But like really, I think we've been accused on that in many levels, and I think it's a bit toxic of this event as well. You know, like being in documenta. You know, as a big mythical. I think that's why I'm a bit disappointed with Charles. You know, like again. Sorry, no, I'm just joking. But you know, like bring this as a mythical machine again, you know, like I think I don't know how to do that, you know, but this is maybe we should stop that. We should stop this making this event at this stage as really as one of the mythical machine, which is also very modern at the same time, you know, like you're just doing canonizing, actually. But yeah, I think this, in a certain scale, in a certain way, it's really also about that, and it's very toxic and it's very tiring, and I think it really should stop, and we should see differently as well. I think we should work differently. On like really like dealing with such a event, you know, like I always thinking that it should be downscale, for example. It should be decentralized. It's really, you know, because again, you know, like this machine is really keep on eating us. I think we should really stop that. And during the process, actually, a long time ago, I was like afraid that we cannot achieve, or like there's two things that really point that really can bother me. Is actually one, the difficulties to translate a lot of practice from different localities to Kassel, and then also to bring the cycle back. That's actually the one, make that full cycle is actually one thing that is really challenging, and actually I think we are succeeded, I hope, doing it in Kassel, but I think the question is like how we're going to do it also full cycle. What does that mean for Jatiwangi? What does that mean for Wajuku? What does that mean for Wakalibut? You know, being in Documenta, it's a great show here, but what it's Kassel people really care about what's happening really in Wakalibut neighborhood and so on. Otherwise, it's going to be just like Venice Biennale. You know, like they don't care about what happened they just care about pavilion being sold, you know. So this really extractive mode, I think we should really stop, and like really building this full cycle. I think this is what Lumbung is actually would like to do. That's one thing that really bothers and also challenge us as well. We have to do a lot of stuff in the documenta economic that we should change. The second is actually to make Western contemporary art great again. That how not to make Western contemporary art great again. Thank you, Richard.
Yeah, and also when we got documenta, when we were selected, we never see it up until now. We never see being artistic director of Documenta 15 as a power. Because we don't have this pre-power syndrome, we don't have this in-power syndrome, and we're not going to have a post-power syndrome. So, yeah. Any question?
Yes,
Hi
please.
there. Oh,
Well,
yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. Hi, I'm right here. I just wanted to say thank you so much again for this incredible show. I'd always wanted to come to Documenta, but never just could afford it. Could think, I would travel this far. And I think that when I found out that it was a collective of the global majority that was curating it, it made me want to come. And still, money, time, everything. And then it was when I saw the release of the findings from the scientific committee and your letter back that I decided to just, make the trip, because I wanted to see it for myself. I wanted to talk to people here. I wanted to be here, and I wanted to show solidarity. And so I think just despite all the flooding of media, whatever we can all do to talk, to write, to share, to overcome these narratives is really important work. And so thank you for all of your work. Charles, I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you so much. And I think it gave me a few things to think about because as a person from a country that has been used as a pawn in global power games and in Western power games, it often makes me think about whose imagination is resourced and given power and attention. Absolutely. And so the work that y'all have been doing to distribute resources and overcome the legal battles and whatnot to make sure that folks in the global majority are resourced is just incredible, and so thank you. And then I also think about, given that our countries have been so fucked over by Western imperialism, it's also like, who has to apologize? And who gets redemption? The fact of our countries have been so harmed by Western capitalism, by neoliberal institutions, and folks have not apologized. And yet you bring us onto your turf, on your terms, in terms of the language and frames that you understand, to continue to assert supremacy. And I think there just, it needs to be questions around who has to apologize for what and who gets redemption. And I think the risk that this team has bared is just, and who has to bear the risk, who has to bear the responsibility is something that I've just been thinking a lot about. And so my question for ruruHaus is, I'd be really curious about how you all, when I don't want to talk about the controversies, but it's clearly what we're talking about here. I'd be really curious about how did you first understand it when it erupted, and then how do you understand it now? And then what this means for how you all want to keep moving forward in the world, putting out your radical, beautiful, gorgeous, nurturing visions, because we need more of it. We all know this. And so thank you again.
Yeah.
You maybe?
Your question is that how do we understand this controversy? Since it came for the first time in January, up until now, we still don't understand. We still don't understand up until now. Yeah. But some of our friends are trying to help us to understand. But maybe we will understand it after this end, the 100 days end, when we go home and see Germany from the distance that we'll never see the same again. Yeah. Before we saw Germany as a land of achievement in science and everything, like a land of Freiheit. But then we are accused, and then we still don't understand up until now. But it teaches us a lot of things, and then some of our friends really help us to understand. And then we will understand it deeply when we are at home, see it from a distance. We'll never be the same again to see it again. That's from me. That's my. It's not 2 cents. It's 1 billion euros. So yeah.
Yeah, it's a mixed feelings, of course. Like it's hard to it's hard to digest many times because it's goes from personal into social, political as well, and we know that the translation is going to be a big challenge because we're not going to do like sort of like representational kind of work. I mean, like for example, dealing with context. Let's say it's like the most popular word in Documenta 15. Context. We approach it differently. You know, we approach it differently. I think for a certain society, it will contextualization means you put a text that it's actually explaining what it is and so on. But for us to understand or like dealing with the different contexts is actually building or like setting up ruruHaus. 2.5 years. 2 of our friends with their families come here and setting up space because that's how we work. We're not a curator that, you know, thinking about that's a good theme, that's good issue, that's interesting issues, and then try to deal with it. We go from the streets, from the space. We're listening to the people. We're listening to the space. We would like to breathe the same air. That's for us is contextualization. Those 2 friends dealing. That's why Andan was like really thanking them and also thanking everyone in Kassel that's actually been really great. Also have a lot of conversation, a lot of connection, interaction, collaboration as well. That also I think it's a bit informed or like underestimated, or like it's kind of like it's not really appear in media even how this actually those like real conversation is actually happening. That's what we are thinking about. Context and also about Philip actually yesterday talking about understanding and responsibilities. That's how we work. You know, like this exhibition is not for politician. This exhibition is for you. It's for the people. So for us, that's more important than anything. And to keep that pace, you know, like one might call it we are naive or like we are irresponsibility, but I mean, like we have our own way to deal with such a things. We experience for 20 years. You know, like we're dealing with a lot of stuff as well. How to build the space and then also really deal with a lot of stuff. So it teaches, like Anand said, it teaches a lot. And also questions a lot as well. You know, like are we obliged to fix European problems, German problems? What about other struggles? What about our struggles back home? It's just also about direction, right? I really like Richard Bell's remarks the other day. You know, like I can give you, but I will send you invoice. No, sorry, just jokes. Next, yeah, I will try to, as much as I can, to leave Europe alone. No, that's not a joke. But yeah, I think I had. Me personally, if I can, yeah, it's. I think I will get a bit distance and we'll work more. I mean, like. Personally, I will work more on lumbung Indonesia and of course still connect with other part of the world. But that's sort of like what we would like to do. I mean, like different member will have a different answer to your question as well, actually. Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, also appreciating our friends who've been preparing this, like our friends from Tone Direct, the simultaneous translator, and also the international sign. Yeah. And also, and also our friends Felipe, Alicia, and also, yeah. But before you, this is I think the last question, because we need to appreciate them, and also Felipe and then the team. We need to appreciate them to also to have a rest, because we've been here since 4 o'clock, and then yeah. Yeah, we need to take a rest for a while and then have party and hang out later.
What a responsibility to make a last question.
Yeah, please.
Well, first of all, Charles, thank you so much for your analysis of this document. We are all of us aware we are living a shifty point in the history of exhibitions with this document, and thanks to Ruan Group. We are living a moment where new possibilities of doing things, of doing works, of being together were visible with this document. And I think this is a therapy. This is a therapy we need to assume. Lumbung is not something we import in Europe and we apply to our context or we export to the world. But Lumbung is something that exists in all the worlds existing in this world. In all the worlds who were destroyed, threatened, diminished by colonialism, by capitalism. And Lumbung is a social resistance, is a social persistence, and we can identify Lumbungs in African cultures, in Oceanic cultures, in South American indigenous cultures, in black cultures. And what is important is to identify the closest Lumbung to ourselves, to our earths, because it exists. And even in Europe, where we destroy our popular ancestralities, the ancestralities of our popular cultures, where capitalism erased all the popular roots of this European diversity, it's possible still to find resisting Lumbungs. Thank you so much for this wonderful group of curators, and to all the artists, cultural workers, activists, and members of and workers in this document. This is an historical moment, and all of us will become ambassadors of Lumbung.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. See you tomorrow at the same hour, 4 p.m. We're going to have Hilmar Farid, and then Nikos Papastergiadis.
Hilmar, very good.
4 p.m. and 6 p.m. So we're waiting you here to meet again in the same hour. Thank you so much.